And if I may offer you a very warm welcome to the chapel of Keble College for this celebration of Bryan Magee's life. I'm Jonathan Phillips, the warden of the college. Now, it seems to me that if anyone doubts that this should be an occasion suffused with optimism, look at the final passage of the third volume of Bryan's autobiography, which is quoted in the programme you all have. But I'm bound to say that such optimism was not something always associated in his mind with Keble. In the second volume of that compelling work, he writes about his experience in the winter of 1947-48, when he came up to Keble, to which he deliberately applied to take the entrance examination in history. I quote briefly, and with omissions, from an extensive passage. He writes, "I did not have any preconceived idea of the college as a place, but I found it actively depressing. Built on the largest of scales, it was Victorian Gothic throughout and clamantly ugly. The endless corridors were loweringly institutional, with rooms opening off them that you found yourself reluctant to go into, as in a hospital or a prison. I had never felt such dismay as this in a new place. It was compounded when the other candidates started discussing the colleges they were staying in. It began to sound as if Keble were some sort of joke college, notorious not only for its ugliness, but also for low standards of every other kind." Well, I'm very glad to tell you, those of you who haven't read the second volume of Bryan's autobiography, that a few pages further on, and with the perspective of writing in 2007, having been an honorary fellow of Keble at that stage for some 13 years, he wrote as follows. "Having written so harshly of the Keble of that time, I must in fairness add that the college has long ceased to be as it was then. Its rise to excellence was one of the supreme success stories of Oxford in the second half of the 20th century. And against that background, reinforced by many years of Bryan's warm and inquiring engagement with members of the Senior Common Room and our graduate student community here, I and the Fellows of Keble are delighted to accede to his wish that this celebration of his life takes place here." And I'm now going to hand over to Henry Hardy, Bryan's executor.
I echo the warden's welcome to you all. Thank you all for coming. I deliberately called this a celebration rather than a memorial. The idea is to have fun, not to be mournful. Again, in the spirit of Bryan's wonderfully optimistic account of the experience of having lived on this planet. I should just perhaps offer a brief apology to those of you who came to the funeral. You will find there is a degree of overlap. I thought it would be artificial to try and make the two occasions entirely distinct, and I think all the common elements bear repetition. One thing I did say at the funeral, and I will say again, is by way of an explanation for why we are in a religious building when, as those of you, most of you will know, Bryan had no religious beliefs of his own. In an article published in 2011 called Intimations of Mortality, he wrote, "What I consider most likely to be true is that death will be the complete and utter end of my existence, with no successor existence of any kind that can be related to me as I now am. What I want to be true is that I have an individual innermost self, a soul, which is the real me and which survives my death. But alas, I do not believe it." So, Bryan, the explanation in the light of that passage of why we're here is the following passage from a letter Bryan wrote to me in 2001 about the arrangements he wanted to be made for his various obsequies, for his funeral and a possible memorial event. He said, "I have no religious beliefs myself, but no objection to a religious service being held if that is the easiest appropriate course to follow." As the warden said, he also wanted the event to be held in Keble, and which is where he began his lifelong connection with Oxford. And it's such a splendid space that seems justification itself. And I'm grateful to the chaplain for his broad-mindedness in allowing us to have a secular event in his building. In the same letter, Bryan made clear that he wanted music to be center stage in any celebration of his life, as it was in that life itself. Bryan, in conversation, was absolutely clear and passionate about the centrality of music in his life. It was up there with sex as one of the two most important features of his life. And he was endlessly going to concerts, operas of all kinds. Among his papers, there were some notebooks, which are kind of like pensées, like Pascal's pensées, little fragments of thought, which possibly one day we may be able to publish, at least a selection. And in them, among them, you find many short remarks about music, and I've selected just a few to read to you. "Music is my ruling passion. Great music is valid metaphysics. Music is the soul of the world. Music is the voice of interior reality. Music is the inside of things. Music is the real world. Musicians are the children of God. The world is music embodied. Music is where everyone is. Music is real being." I don't pretend to understand exactly what Bryan meant by these remarks, but I think they convey clearly how important music was to him, at the very least, even if he was groping to put into words exactly what it meant. In the same letter that I've quoted from before, he named several works, musical works, that could be performed at an occasion like this, and if they were performed end to end, I think they would last about 2.5 hours. So I've selected 3 that can be fitted into an event of reasonable length. And I'm very grateful to the Amherst Sextet for agreeing to perform them. Before, though, we hear the first of the works, I want to rectify an unintended omission from my remarks at Bryan's funeral. As you will know, Bryan became more and more disabled in the last years of his life and eventually unable to walk and confined to a wheelchair. And he lived the last few years of his life in a nursing home in Headington. You will also know, I assume, that he had a very, very strong need to get out somewhere every evening. He felt claustrophobic if he was trapped in his own home. He wanted to go out to a film, to a concert, to an opera, whatever it might be. And he was very fortunate, as are we all, that a friend of his in Headington, Peter McCarter, was on hand and took him out regularly and did all sorts of other things for him for ages at the end of his life. And I can't exaggerate how important his practical friendship was to Bryan's last years and months, and how much happier it made him that Peter was there to help him. So I want to thank him very much indeed for everything that he did, including compiling Bryan's tax returns, which I've had to do for the last year, and it's not a task I would wish on anybody. So, without more ado, we're now going to hear the first of the 3 pieces, the sextet from Capriccio. I'm glad you clapped. I was going to invite you to do so, but luckily I didn't need to. I remember once going to the Three Choirs Festival in Gloucester Cathedral, and a priest began the proceedings by saying, "This is a house of worship, a solemn, holy place, and you're not to applaud after the concert." And I've never heard such loud applause as followed the concert. And I'm going to show you a few slides from Bryan's life, just to run through his growth and career. There is the one up on the screen is taken at Wolfson with the Wolfson punts quite recently, or comparatively recently, by a freelance photographer for an article about Bryan in The Guardian. That's Bryan as a page boy at a wedding. Don't know whose. That's the youngest photograph I found. He had a huge box of photographs in his papers, and I've taken these from that. That's Bryan with his father and mother, a little bit older. And that's a little bit older again with his father, and on the left, his sister Joan, whom I assume is dead. I didn't manage to contact her, so she lived in the States. This is Bryan at Christ's Hospital, wearing the uniform of that institution. And there's Bryan with his friend Norman Tilson, who's here today, roughly at the age of 20. So during his Keble years, I think we can say. Very dapper in his bow tie. And now we have a few, or three photographs, I think, from his campaign in 1960 in the mid-Bedfordshire by-election, which he lost resoundingly, talking to people who lived there. Constituents is the word I'm searching for, yes, talking to constituents. Nicely posed photographs. I don't think Bryan ever laid a brick, but that's the one that's on the back of the program. Right, Bryan, in the notebook of thoughts which I referred to earlier, one of the remarks contains this sentence: "My greatest gift is for public speaking." And I'm going to illustrate this now, I hope. In his papers, I found two old-style reel-to-reel tapes with no labels on them. I had no idea what they were. So I sent them to the National Sound Archive in London at the British Library and had them digitized. One of them was Conductor Tantrums, which it was a series of recordings of rehearsals by famous orchestras with the conductors losing their tempers with the players, which is very entertaining to listen to, but I'm not offering you that today. The other was a recording made in 1952 at the Oxford Union presidential debate, which is the debate at which the president is selected for the coming term. So the various speakers are competing with each other to impress the audience. And Bryan was, I think, treasurer at this time. He became president of the Union the following term as a result of this speech. There you have the motion. This House sees no sufficient cause to abandon bipartisanship in British foreign policy. There's nothing about that topic in this excerpt. I'm just going to play you the very beginning of the speech, in which consists largely of jokes. The quality of the recording is unfortunately pretty poor, and I don't think it's helped much by the Keble Chapel sound system, but I have got a transcript on the screen, which I hope you will be able to follow. So can we have that? Yeah.
I call on Mr. Bryan Magee, Keble, Treasurer, to oppose the motion.
It's a tremendous pleasure, Mr. President, to see our two guests sitting here tonight. Lady Violet Bonham Carter, the great daughter of the old statesman, and Mr. Kingsley Martin, the little father of the new statesman. As a Liberal, Lady Violet can still be described as being in politics, though only just. Though well to the right of the Liberal Party, she is no conservative, but a genuine reformer. For whereas conservatives are content with existing evils, Lady Violet, as a Liberal, wants to replace them with new ones. The Liberal Party is split, of course. It has its right and its left. And indeed, we depend upon this for the smooth working of our six-party system. But it brings together much that is good in the other parties into a single program, fair shares of inequality. It is a party with a great future behind it. If Lady Violet is unique among politicians, Mr. Kingsley Martin is a rare bird among journalists. The New Statesman and Nation, known affectionately in Oxford as the naggers and staggers, is not so much a political weekly as a whole circulating library with a disappointed smile and high blood pressure. Mr. Martin became its editor in 1931 and has made it the best one-man show in British journalism. I don't know what he's going to say tonight, although I shall be very surprised if he doesn't. The charge of inconsistency, which is frequently brought against political journalists, can never be levelled at Mr. Kingsley Martin. The merest glance at our bound copies of the New Statesman will show that he is still saying exactly the same things now. A fine record, and I congratulate him on it.
That was recorded by a freelance sound engineer on 15-minute discs and offered for sale to the people who had been speaking, and Bryan bought it, which is why I found it among his papers. Strange how different people's voices were earlier in their lives, it seems to me. Much higher, as well as more RP in Bryan's case. I'm now going to show you two short excerpts from one of Bryan's television series on philosophy, which are possibly his best-known contribution to culture. He had a terrific gift for popularizing philosophy, and he was a brilliant interviewer. So the first clip shows him introducing the series Men of Ideas, which was a series of interviews with distinguished living philosophers. And here is his introduction to the first episode, which was an interview with Isaiah Berlin about the nature of philosophy.
This is the first in a series of programs about modern philosophy. Later in the series, we shall be dealing with the ideas of such world-famous figures as Jean-Paul Sartre, Marcuse, Karl Popper, Chomsky, and some of these will be taking part personally in the programmes, discussing their own work. One or two programmes will also be devoted to thinkers who are dead, but whose ideas still exert an enormous and living influence. Karl Marx is an obvious example, but so too, in their quite different ways, are Wittgenstein and Heidegger. And of course, a series produced in English for an English-speaking audience must pay particular attention to recent developments in philosophy in the English-speaking world. So my hope is that the series as a whole will add up to a lively and illuminating report on the state of philosophy in the world today, partly in terms of outstanding individuals and partly in terms of important movements. But in the opening programme, by way of introduction, I want to confront some absolutely basic questions. Why should anyone be interested in philosophy anyway? Why is it important? Indeed, what is it exactly?
The next and last slide is from later in the same programme, where he exhibits one of his great skills, which is to offer a summary, a clarifying summary, an improving summary of the remarks that his interlocutor has made beforehand. And this was this particular example of it was so striking that it generated a wonderful parody in Private Eye, where the interviewer was called Bryan Magee. So here he is summarizing what Berlin has said to him about the nature of philosophical questions.
What I'd like to, if I may, is, as it were, recapitulate how we've got to the point we're at before we start making further forward moves. Yes. I take it that what you're saying is that throughout the history of mankind, men in their search for knowledge have asked most commonly two kinds of questions. In the first place, there are questions about the world. Man is simply finding out about and mastering his environment and coping with his environment. And questions about the world are answered by looking at it, by investigation, observation, testing, experiment, and so on. Yes. These are factual questions. The second kind of question are questions of a more abstract or formal kind, like questions in mathematics or in logic or, as you said, in games or in heraldry. And with questions of this kind, you can't find out the answer by observing the world, because questions of this kind concern the interrelationships between entities inside formal systems, the one we most commonly use obviously being that of arithmetic or more generally mathematics. So you have empirical questions about the world, which involve looking at the facts, and formal questions which involve relating one thing to another inside a formal system. And that nearly all knowledge, nearly all questions, fall into one of these two baskets, so to speak. Now, what you're saying is, I take it, that philosophical questions, the hallmark of a philosophical question is that it doesn't fall into either of these baskets. A question like, what is a right, is something that you can neither find the answer to by looking out of the window, nor find the answer to by looking at the internal coherence of a formal system. And therefore, you don't know how to go about finding the answer. And this possession of a question without any understanding of how to look for the answer is, as it were, the hallmark of a philosophical question. Is that
You put it
right?
far better than I have, yes, much more clearly.
Well,
I
you
accept
put it
this.
first.
Yes, but I accept this reformulation of it with pleasure.
Okay, we now have the other two pieces of music interspersed with addresses by two persons who require no introduction from me. So let's go start with the Elgar.
Bryan Magee entered my life in 1962 through his recent book, The New Radicalism, when I found myself, I must admit to my own surprise, the adopted prospective Labour parliamentary candidate for Torrington in North Devon, where for me the only issue is whether I could save my deposit at the coming election. As a newly qualified doctor of medicine, I was desperate to find out more of what lay underneath the then Labour Party, led by Hugh Gateskill, a man who to this day has still much wisdom to give to British politics. Bryan, in Chapter 5 of The New Radicalism, Conflicting Elements in Socialist Thought, warned about a form of socialism where wisdom was handed down like orders, down through the social hierarchy, down through the generations. He quoted Karl Popper's presidential address to the Aristotelian Society in October 1958. A school of this kind never admits a new idea. New ideas are heresies, and they lead to splits. Should a member of the school try to change the doctrine, then he is expelled as a heretic. Bryan then went on to explain the heart of Marxism. Marx believed, he wrote, that he had discovered the natural laws of historical change, and that these were scientific laws in precisely the same sense as that in which Newton's laws of motions were scientific laws. Their operation, like that of all other natural laws, was entirely independent of human wishes or motivations. Bryan had a philosophical approach to politics, which I wanted to understand. He wrote then, "Socialism is a hybrid, combining the best traditions of liberal science with some of the worst traditions of oracular pre-science, combining hostility to authority with elements of authoritarianism, crossing humanitarianism with collectivism, idealism with materialism, the belief in moral responsibility with the belief in determinism." We never knew each other well, though we first met and became parliamentary colleagues in the Labour Party in February 1974, when he came in for the safe Labour seat of Leighton. I had come into Parliament 8 years earlier in 1966. He left the Labour Party at the start of 1982. He wrote of this period in his third volume of autobiography, Making the Most of It. "It is important for me to say that I left the Labour Party not in order to join the Social Democrats, but because I could not go on any longer in the Labour Party. I was not enthusiastic about the new party and did not join it immediately on leaving the Labour Party. Roy Jenkins, as SDP leader, asked him to be the party's frontbench spokesman on education, but he refused, as this would entail sacrificing his private working time, and he was already beginning to write a lot. When he lost his seat in 1983, he quietly left his membership of the SDP, and it lapsed. Yet he writes of this 9-year period in the House of Commons. Very interestingly, "I would not unwish the period I spent in the House. It was an enormous, many-sided experience and taught me a great deal. I learnt from close up how the country is actually governed, not only nationally but locally, and I was a small cog in the process." This was a man who'd been on our television screens frequently on This Week and a television program and reporting all around the world. With his political and philosophical beliefs, it was impossible for Bryan to be at ease in either the Labour Party or the SDP. He wrote in the preface to The New Radicalism, "Socialists had always believed that the measures would actualize the ideals, and it is this belief that was wrong. But this means that something fundamental to the whole socialist philosophy was wrong." And at the end of his book, he writes, "What is needed? A dynamic philosophy free of the major conservative and Marxist fallacies, appropriate to the world as it actually is today. It is not a fixed philosophy." What I always liked about Bryan's attitude to politics was he saw the need to be ever alive, ever thinking, ever seeking out new ideas and new approaches is more important in politics than in any other aspect of human life, he wrote. It should be the mainspring of a radical party. He also warned about the innocence of responsibility. Amongst some socialists, their aim was not to direct society, but to play a particular role irrespective of its effect. That is true of the trade unions, but also true, he wrote, of everyone who wants the Labour Party to promote the interests of one class against another. This is irresponsibility in the deeper sense. The need to embrace the whole impact of policies, which is the life of politics, was essential to Bryan. When he reached at the age of 40, he concluded there was only one philosopher that he had not read, and that was Schopenhauer. And when he did, he claimed he changed my life, because he writes with the deepest insight about the profoundest of all questions of human beings, namely, how human experience itself is to be understood. Typically, Bryan asks that we should not read his first edition of the OUP book, Philosophy of Schopenhauer, published in 1983, but OUP's revised and enlarged edition, published in 1997. I confess I have not read it, but reading more about his own writings over the last few months and weeks, I have vowed to myself that in my retirement from politics, I will read this book. Whether I will understand it is a rather different question. The last time I saw Bryan was over dinner in my home in Limehouse a few years ago, and I was particularly pleased that one of my sons was there as well. He had read philosophy at King's, and by then had become a psychiatrist. We had a fascinating evening, and Karl Popper was the common ground. The man whose memory we honor today will fortunately remain with us for decades to come, because I think it is no exaggeration to say that he was the greatest popularizer of philosophy of our generation, in books and on television and film. We've already seen some of it. There is his legacy. In particular, where he drew out from some of our cleverest contemporary philosophers, not least the example we saw of Isaiah Berlin, simple explanations of their views. What I suspect is the most widely read of all his books by people who are not philosophers is Dorling Kindersley's edition of The Story of Philosophy, published in 1998. Pictures and words are well worth more than just a glance. Bryan Riley remarked in Making the Most of It, the 18 years of Conservative government, 1979 to 1997, coincided with the peak years of my professional life. But in his teaching here in Oxford, he has left a human legacy of undergraduates and postgraduates who got to know him one-on-one and were then in the presence of a very considerable mind.
How Bryan would have relished that thrilling recasting of the Prelude to Tristan for string sextet. Has made me hear it all over again. And of course, Tristan was, for I think, Bryan, the greatest of all Wagner's works, because perhaps the most Schopenhauerian. And it was Wagner that eventually led to my friendship, my transforming and profoundly nourishing friendship with Bryan. But that was about 10 years ago that we became friends. But he had already entirely changed my life 40 years before. people often are asked in those terrible Sunday Times questionnaires about the book that changed their life. And it's normally Jane Austen, or sometimes it's the Bible, or some major sort of tome of our tradition, generally. But for me, the book that changed my life and really set the course of my life in a way was a book written by Bryan, or published by, anyway, in 1966. And it's called 1 in 20. And the 1 in 20 are the 1 in 20 of the population who are homosexual. And I was 17 at the time, and living the life that many young gay men were leading, which is one of extreme anxiety, really. Because we'd not long come out of various scandals like the Vassal case and so on, and only 10 years before the Montague trial was very vividly still in our minds. Essentially, as a young person who knew himself to be gay, I felt discarded, despised, rejected, loathed, to be suppressed, to be put in prison, to be exiled if possible, altogether not likely to make much of a contribution to my society and not likely to have a very happy life. And almost all the books that one could ever read on the subject were either extremely depressing, like the Pink Pelican book called Homosexuality by an ex-military doctor called D.J. West, which literally stated that if you're homosexual and if you intend to live your life as a homosexual, you will have a miserable and probably a pointless life. And on the other hand, there were, of course, books, because this is the period of ferment. We had the Wolfenden Report, and already people were beginning to think the law should change. And there was a very, very growing militant revolutionary view of homosexuality, a very angry one in many cases, one which proposed that perhaps gay people should have a separate life from heterosexual people. We had nothing in common. There was no way that we could be part of an integrated society. And of course, I read some of those books, but with equal distress, really. I didn't see why my whole life should mean that I would be defined by this one aspect of me, why I should now fight and become a full-time militant. I was all for fighting, but I didn't want to be defined in this way. And then came Bryan's book, which was utterly radical in the sense that, like everything else about Bryan, it was entirely rational, balanced, clear. It looked very calmly at the situation. And it came to a very sensible conclusion, which was that homosexuality has been with us since the beginning of civilized records, that it appears that a certain number of the population have these inclinations, which essentially do no harm unless pursued in a harmful way. And it's hard now, in the light of the transformations of the last few years particularly, to even imagine how radical those words were, how they transformed my view of myself, and how they essentially gave me an optimistic view of myself and perhaps of society too. I don't know what influence Bryan's book had. I don't know whether it really did contribute to, as I say, the changes that have occurred, but for it to exist at all, that book, I hope lots and lots of people read it. I read it the other day, and it's still an absolute model of, I don't think Bryan had any particular axe to grind at all. He just said, well, this is a situation that needs to be looked at clearly and calmly, and he did so in his famously clear, lucid, and unemotional style. So that made a huge difference to my life. And then I read another book by Bryan, which made almost as big a difference. Not quite as big, of course, but it transformed my view of Wagner, aspects of Wagner. Wonderful book, very brief, 110 pages or something like that. Again, wonderfully lucid, wonderfully clear, abolishing myths about Wagner, going straight to the heart of what he was about, of the extraordinary revolutionary that he was. It dealt head-on with, for example, Wagner's loathsome anti-Semitism by putting it in a context, at least, so as one could see how this had come about, how it had come about in 19th century society, but particularly how Wagner would be involved in it. And I became a Wagnerian pretty well from that moment on. And then, of course, like, as we've seen here, the omnipresence of Bryan in that period, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, on television, documentaries, these astonishing interviews with the philosophers, more wonderful books, the book about Popper, all of this. Absolutely wonderful. So Bryan was, though of course not knowing it at all, had penetrated my whole being in so many different ways. It was almost as if he was a sort of, in a T.S. Eliot sense, a sort of a guardian, someone who was hovering around in my aura. And so I was extremely excited but very nervous to meet him, which I did at a party. And it wasn't a long conversation, but I was suddenly subjected, personally, to that gaze, the gaze that we see so wonderfully clearly in the picture of him by the Punts, with spectacles like two large television screens, peering in at you with absolute fascination, as if one were in a zoo, perhaps, but equally with a great sort of warmth and charm about him, but penetrating and stripping one bare of one's content, it seemed to me. But as I say, it was a brief conversation, and we didn't see. I had no reason to expect to meet him again at all. Then I came to Oxford Playhouse, and I did a show, a one-man play at the Playhouse, and at the stage door was a package for me, and it contained the utterly remarkable book that Bryan wrote about Wagner and philosophy. However, I was doing something else. I had 19 other things to do, projects and so on, and I put it somewhere where I would be able to access it. And by chance, some couple of years later, I was asked by the Royal Opera House to write a show about Wagner, a little challenge, and they wanted it to be quite brief but entertaining and blah blah. And so I accepted, and then found myself working my way through some of the vast body of works about Wagner, coming from every possible angle. And I became rather interested in, of course, who would not in his life, interested in the work, but couldn't really get a proper handle on who this man really was at core. And then really, I don't know why I thought of it. I said, well, there's this book called Wagner and Philosophy, perhaps that'll tell me something. And it told me everything I needed to know. That book is the most astounding account of the work, the mind of an artist, of the way in which this particular artist had to function in order to create the art that he made. And as Bryan says in the book, Wagner's one of the really only, well, I don't know of any other composer who defined himself through philosophy. And Bryan traces wonderfully his journey through the philosophers who influenced him until he reached Schopenhauer, which was his end destination, really. And but because of Bryan's passion for music, his profound immersion in Wagner, you absolutely saw that this was a man. It wasn't that he was simply sublimely inspired, but that he'd worked incredibly hard, that he on philosophy in order to release something in himself as a composer, that he could not, as Bryan so sharply makes us see, he could not write at all until he'd sorted out what he felt about the world. That's unique and extraordinary. And I saw then that I had my way into Wagner, and that my show would be largely a revelation or an embodiment of that idea. And so then I got in touch with Bryan, and that's when I finally met him, and we properly, and we sat in the Ashmolean, I remember, for some 3 or 4 hours, me largely in the position of Isaiah Berlin in the interview here, but Bryan, with a generous rigor, drained me of what I knew or thought I knew about Wagner, recast it in peerlessly lucid form, and not only lucid, but in attractive form, in exciting, dramatized form. And I discovered more and more as I got to know Bryan that he was passionate about the theatre, as passionate almost about the theatre as he was about music, and as learned, and had indeed been a critic, had been one of the critics, the BBC's critics, and had been a critic for a newspaper as well. He understood, it seemed, this from the inside. And thereafter followed a whole series of conversations and letters and thoughts and so on, which led to the play that I did at the Opera House, which was called Inside Wagner's Head, and eventually to a book that I wrote called Being Wagner. But it was extraordinary to be connected to Wagner in such intimacy, but even more extraordinary was to be connected to Bryan, to his avidity, to his relish, and as he became more ill and unable to do the things he loved doing, which is to get out and about, unable to even to write, to hold a pen, became immensely difficult for him. Never for 1 second did I sense a diminution of any kind in his appetite for life, for ideas, for friendship, for communication. And once, to my undying shame, I had to come to Oxford to do 2 or 3 things, and I found a space of 45 minutes during which I could see him. And I probably hadn't made it clear that it wouldn't be as long as he might have liked. And I eventually said, Bryan, this is terrible, but I've got to go because I've got to be there. And he said, but don't do this to me, because I value these conversations of ours. They're my life's blood now, and don't come back again unless you have proper time to spend with me, because I need it, I want it, I love it, and to be torn away from it like this is unbearable. It was, I felt, as you can imagine, some shame. And in fact, we never met again, as it happens. That was a great sadness, but still he was in contact. Still he would leave messages on the phone. He would get somebody to write for him, or eventually I think he was able to write again for himself. And the last thing of mine that he saw was a film that I'd acted in, of my one-man version of A Christmas Carol. And Bryan wrote a letter to me saying, I've seen the film twice over. It will outlive both of us. And of course, it has now, very soon, all too soon, outlived Bryan. But it's everything that I do really now as a writer, or even as an actor and as a director, is now imbued with some of Bryan's extraordinary spirit, his ability to make thought dramatic, and to connect one to philosophy in the broadest sense, to thinking about life with such lucidity and avidity, as I said. And I'm infinitely grateful for our friendship.
Now it's your turn. I thought you ought to have a chance to give voice, and what better way of doing it than to sing Jerusalem. Jerusalem.